Welcome, dear listener, to this cozy corner of history. Come rest your weary head and let me spin for you the tales of a time long past. Before we begin our journey into the Middle Ages, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. Are you nestled beneath the covers ready to drift off to sleep, or perhaps you're just settling in for a bit of calming history to unwind after a long day? If you enjoy these quiet musings on days gone by, I invite you to subscribe so you never miss an episode. There's something quite special about letting the past whisper in your ear. Let's begin with a job listing. Picture this: wanted, able-bodied man, must enjoy filth, fear, and the ever-present possibility of death. Compensation: one stale loaf of bread a week. Perks: you might die before you lose all your teeth. Congratulations, you're hired. Welcome to medieval Europe, a place where the phrase dream job mostly meant not immediately fatal. This was a world where labor was not chosen, but endured. There were no career fairs, no HR departments, no retirement plans. If you were lucky, your job only ruined your back. If you were unlucky, it ruined your lungs, your sanity, your skin, and then killed you anyway. And this was normal, ordinary, expected. Today, we're going to take a slow, sleepy look at the jobs medieval men endured, because to call it work is too gentle. This was survival, wrapped in grime and blistered hands. Forget knights and troubadours, those were the lucky few. For most men, earning a living meant pain, disease, filth, and early death. Not because they were lazy, but because everything in the world around them was trying to kill them, including the job itself. Let's start by setting the stage. The medieval period stretched roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, a solid millennium of hardship for the working classes. Life expectancy hovered somewhere in the mid-30s, not because people spontaneously dropped dead at 35, but because so many infants and children didn't survive their early years. If you made it to adulthood, congratulations, you still only had a few decades to break your body in service of someone richer than you. There was no industrial revolution, no unions, no work-life balance, just toil. In towns, you worked for a guild, or under a master, or begged for day labor if you were desperate. In the countryside, you worked the land from sunrise to nightfall, and the land did not thank you. Men labored in fields, workshops, rivers, ditches, pits, slaughterhouses, and streets, often without tools, gloves, or boots. OSHA was not invited. You might think, well, wasn't everyone dirty back then? Sort of. But there's a difference between generally dusty and being so caked in human waste that your name becomes synonymous with excrement. Which brings us to many of the charming job titles we'll explore in this series: the gong farmer, the leech collector, the lime burner, and the ever-depressing serf. Their stories are not heroic, but they are absolutely horrifying and kind of amazing in their own right. Some jobs carried real physical danger, others were emotionally destructive. Many combined both. Imagine being an executioner, someone whose job was to end lives with tools that didn't always work, or a plague doctor's assistant, dragging infected corpses into pits while praying your own cough wasn't the beginning of the end. These were not romantic professions, they were barely human ones, and yet, someone had to do them. Every society has its dirty work. The Middle Ages simply had more of it, and fewer ways to protect the people doing it. But before we dive into specific jobs, let's clear up a few myths. First, not everyone worked these jobs. There were merchants, scribes, clergy, artisans. But those were the minority. Most medieval men were peasants or laborers. And of those laborers, many were stuck in roles that were physically brutal, socially reviled, and spiritually soul-crushing. Second, wages were not a given. Some of these men were paid in coin. Many were paid in food, lodging, or simply the hope that they wouldn't be whipped. If you were a serf, you weren't even technically allowed to leave the land you were born on. You worked it, you died on it, and your children inherited your suffering. Finally, yes, some of these jobs did come with a kind of dark pride, a sense that what you were doing mattered, even if it was horrible. The executioner, for instance, might be feared and hated, but he also held a strange position of power. The bell foundry worker could point to a cathedral and say, That's my sound ringing across the valley. But pride doesn't protect you from molten metal or mob justice. We tend to imagine history through the lives of kings and conquerors. But those men sat on top of a world quite literally built on the backs of workers. People whose names we'll never know, whose hands were blistered, whose lungs were ruined, whose lives were spent in trenches, pits, mines, and swamps. Their jobs were not dramatic in the Hollywood sense, but they were absolutely cruel in every way that mattered. So as you settle in for the next few chapters, remember this: medieval life wasn't just about sin plagues. It was about work. Relentless, brutal, soul-numbing work. And for men at the bottom of the social ladder, their job was their identity and their punishment. Now, take a deep breath. Try not to smell the cesspit, because next, we'll meet the gong farmer, a man whose job was literally everyone else's business. The gong farmer. Yes, gong. Not as in a musical instrument. In medieval English, gong was a polite-ish word for human waste. Feces, excrement, poo. So a gong farmer wasn't farming carrots. He was farming everything that left the human body after it was done digesting the carrots. He was, quite literally, a professional poop shoveler. And unlike most awful jobs, this one actually paid fairly well, because no one else wanted to do it. Let's slowly descend into this unfortunate man's world. Picture a medieval town. Narrow streets, wooden buildings, open gutters, no plumbing. People ate, drank, and went about their business, and then they needed to get rid of the result. If you were rich, you had a privy, an early toilet, built over a cesspit or sewer. If you were poor, you might just throw it in the street. Either way, waste accumulated. It didn't disappear on its own. That's where the gong farmer came in. By law, especially in more regulated cities like London, these cesspits had to be emptied. Otherwise, they overflowed into cellars and streets. So, in the dead of night, because no one wanted to see this done in daylight, gong farmers would descend into the pits with long-handled shovels and buckets. Often, these pits were several feet deep, filled with years of compacted human waste. A good night's haul could include solid waste, liquid runoff, rotting food, bits of cloth, the occasional dead rat, and sometimes even bones. The smell, indescribable. The danger, very real. You see, these cesspits emitted methane and hydrogen sulfide, which meant a careless gong farmer could be overcome by toxic fumes and collapse. Some died on the job, suffocated or drowned in sludge. That's right. Drowning in excrement was an actual occupational hazard. The job was typically done in teams. One man would shovel, another would haul the buckets, and someone else would transport the waste out of town. This waste, believe it or not, was not thrown away. It was often sold to farmers as fertilizer. After all, what's a better way to grow next year's? Gong farmers were required by law to work only at night. They had to avoid populated areas and often wore bells, or called out to alert people so they could stay far away. Their clothing was usually thick, heavy, and worn to the same jobs repeatedly, because once you worked as a gong farmer, your smell became permanent. No amount of washing could fully remove the stench. It seeped into your skin, your hair, your soul. And what about public opinion? Gong farmers were despised and feared. They were considered unclean, both physically and morally. People would cross the street to avoid them. They were often forced to live on the edges of town, sometimes literally outside the walls. Their children were bullied. Their wives, if they had any, shared in the social isolation. Yet the irony is that their job was essential. Without them, towns would have become literal cesspools. Disease would have spread even faster than it already did. In a way, gong farmers were frontline public health workers, saving lives with every bucket of filth they removed. And they weren't necessarily poor. Because the job was so awful, it actually paid relatively well. Some gong farmers earned enough to retire early. Others used their wages to buy land, or invest in better trades for their sons. So while society sneered, the gong farmer quietly saved up and built a better life. If he could survive the years of stench and humiliation, there are records of some trying to quit the job, only to find that no one would hire them for anything else. Once you'd been a gong farmer, you were permanently tainted. You might have enough money to buy a decent house, but your neighbors would never let you forget the smell. Even the tools of the trade were cursed. Their shovels, buckets, and clothing were often burned when they died. The idea of passing these items on was unthinkable. Imagine inheriting your father's poop bucket, a symbol of his life's work, and the worst family heirloom ever conceived. Some towns imposed rules about where gong farmers could dispose of the waste. Rivers, fields, and deep pits were common dumping grounds. But when that system broke down, usually due to corruption or laziness, the waste would pile up, sometimes for years. One famous case in London in the 14th century involved a landlord who failed to maintain a cesspit under his property. It eventually collapsed, and the tenants fell into it. They had to be rescued from a flood of waste. The owner was fined, and the gong farmers were brought in to do an emergency clean-out, likely while holding their breath and reconsidering every choice they had ever made. In some cases, criminals were forced into gong farming as punishment. Judges realized that a few nights in the pits could break even the most hardened thief. Forcing someone into a job so miserable it felt like eternal penance was, in its own way, a medieval version of rehabilitation or psychological torture, depending on your perspective. And yet not everything was bleak. Some gong farmers banded together into unofficial guilds, protected each other, and negotiated higher pay. A few even gained a sort of notoriety. Men, whose endurance was legendary, who worked for decades without losing their sanity or stomach lining. They were heroes of the shadows, protectors of sanitation, keepers of the collective bowel. But history has mostly forgotten them. No stained glass windows depict their deeds. No ballads were sung in their honor. Yet they kept the cities running, quite literally, from the bottom up. So, next time you flush a toilet, take a quiet moment to remember the gong farmer, the man who walked into darkness, shovel in hand, and returned with a full bucket and a soul forever stained. Let's climb into one of the most claustrophobic and soot-choked professions in medieval life, the job of the chimney climber. The human sweep before brushes were invented, before safety was invented, and certainly before childhood labor laws were a thing. Now, when you imagine chimney sweeps, your mind might wander to cheerful Victorian children, dancing across rooftops with a song in their hearts, and soot on their faces. But rewind a few hundred years to the medieval period, and the picture becomes darker, and much, much filthier. First, we need to understand chimneys themselves. In early medieval homes, people just let the smoke from indoor fires drift out through a hole in the roof or a simple flue. But as architecture advanced, especially in towns and cities, dedicated chimneys became more common. By the 13th and 14th centuries, large buildings like castles, monasteries, and manors had extensive chimney networks built from stone or brick, snaking through upper levels, branching in unpredictable ways. And with chimneys came soot, lots of it. When wood or coal burned inefficiently, and it always did, soot built up on the interior walls of the chimney. Over time, this coating of black, oily dust could become inches thick. Not only did it stink, but it was dangerous. If left too long, the soot could ignite and cause a chimney fire, which often spread rapidly to the rest of the building. A wealthy lord's greatest fear, after rebellion and plague, was losing his home to a fire started by his own fireplace. Enter the chimney climber, a man, sometimes a boy, whose job was to climb inside the chimney and scrape out the soot. Not from the top, mind you, from the inside. This job involved shimmying up narrow shafts, scraping the walls with a metal scraper, and forcing the clumps downward into sacks or onto the hearth. It was, by all definitions, a living hell. The dimensions of these medieval chimneys varied. Some were wide enough to crouch inside, others barely wide enough for a grown man's shoulders, which is why children and small men were often chosen for the job, not because they were nimble or gifted, but because they were small enough to fit. It didn't matter if they were strong. It mattered that they didn't get stuck. And yes, they got stuck. Frequently, some climbers died lodged inside chimneys, unable to move, slowly asphyxiating from the soot and lack of oxygen. Others fell. A slip meant broken limbs or death. There were no safety harnesses, no ladders, just hands, knees, and raw hope. The soot itself was toxic. It contained carbon particles, tar, and creosote. Long-term exposure damaged the lungs, skin, and eyes. Chimney climbers often coughed black phlegm, developed persistent rashes, and lost their vision early. Many died young from respiratory failure or soot-related cancers, though, of course, no one knew the term back then. They just called it wasting sickness or black breath. What kind of man took this job? Usually, it was the kind of man who had no other options. Orphans, beggars, criminals, widowers, desperate men in desperate times. Some were slaves or indentured servants. Others were simply unlucky enough to be born small and poor. The pay, abysmal. Chimney climbing was piecework, paid per flue, not per hour. A man might climb 10 chimneys in a day, and barely earn enough for stale bread. And if he refused a particularly dangerous shaft, the master might dock his pay or toss him out altogether. In some towns, entire households of climbers lived together, sleeping in soot-stained rooms, coughing through the night, and waking with blackened nails and bleeding hands. They didn't just carry soot on their bodies, they carried it in their lungs, in their dreams, in their prayers. There were no tools to help them. The modern chimney sweep's brush hadn't been invented yet. Some climbers used bundles of thorny branches tied to ropes, dragging them upward to dislodge soot. But for the tightest spaces, there was only one way to clean: crawl inside and scrape. The job was worse in winter. Chimneys were in constant use, which meant climbing while the walls were still hot from fires below. The inside of the shaft could be warm enough to blister skin, and during rainstorms, chimneys became slick and dangerous. Imagine clinging to a vertical stone tube, half blind from soot, coughing and gasping, your fingers numb from cold and blood loss, just so a lord's hearth can roar a little brighter. If a climber survived long enough, he might try to move up in the world. Some formed informal guilds or worked under a master sweep who trained new climbers. But even then, the stigma remained. Chimney climbers were considered unclean, often unwelcome in taverns, inns, or churches. Their clothes stank. Their skin carried a permanent layer of grime. Their very presence reminded others of poverty, desperation, and death. And yet, just like the gong farmer, they performed a crucial service. They prevented fires, preserved homes, and kept the heart of every medieval household, the hearth, burning cleanly. Without them, entire neighborhoods might have gone up in smoke. In rare cases, wealthy households employed live-in climbers, often enslaved boys or impoverished teenagers, whose sole purpose was to clean flues whenever needed. These boys lived in servant quarters, slept near the kitchens, and were summoned at a moment's notice. Their lives were even worse. Their growth was stunted, their ribs bruised from crawling, their coughs never stopped. There were stories, mostly whispered, of boys going mad from the claustrophobia, of men who refused to climb anymore, and were beaten for it, of others who lit small fires in chimneys while they were still inside, hoping the smoke would drive out rats, or loosen soot, only to die gasping in the fumes. One particularly grim legend tells of a climber who, trapped in a narrow flue, scratched a final prayer into the soot with his fingernail before suffocating. Whether true or not, it was the kind of tale passed among chimney men, a reminder of what could await with just one wrong move. No medals were awarded, no names were carved in stone, but these men kept the fires burning, one scrape at a time. So, the next time you enjoy a cozy fire, imagine someone squeezing themselves up through the chimney to clean it by hand, coughing blood as soot filled their lungs. Then take a moment, breathe in that warm air, and remember the forgotten man in the flue. Let's talk about one of the most infamous jobs in medieval society, the executioner. Now, at first glance, this might not seem like such a bad gig. You're not crawling through chimneys or drowning in sewage. You're not clawing leeches off your legs in a swamp or inhaling quicklime dust. You stand in a public square. You raise a weapon. You strike. And that's the job, right? Well, not exactly. Because being a medieval executioner was less about clean kills and more about a lifetime of social exile, emotional torment, and very messy mistakes. Let's begin with the basics. Executioners were government employees, more or less. Every city, town, or region needed someone to carry out capital punishment: hanging, beheading, burning, boiling, breaking on the wheel. Whatever gruesome method was currently fashionable, and someone had to do it. Not the judge, not the mayor, not the man with the nice robe. You, the executioner. But here's the thing, most people didn't want this job. In fact, it was often inherited, not chosen. If your father was an executioner, you were basically stuck. Guilds didn't want you. Church didn't want you. No one wanted to marry you. And if you weren't born into it, you might be offered the role as a form of punishment. Some condemned criminals were given a choice: swing the sword, or swing from the rope. Let's talk tools. Beheadings weren't always done with a sword. In parts of Europe, the axe was more common, and it wasn't sharp or balanced, and neither was the man swinging it. Executions were messy. A single blow often didn't finish the job. Heads were hacked off in 2, 3, sometimes 4 strokes, while the condemned writhed and gurgled. In the worst cases, the executioner panicked and had to improvise, pulling heads free, finishing with a knife, or letting the man bleed out while the crowd gasped. Yes, there were crowds. Executions were public, theatrical, and grotesquely popular. Whole families came to watch. Markets popped up nearby. Children sold bread. Women gossiped. And the executioner stood there, sweating under a hood or helmet, trying not to vomit. His job wasn't just the final blow. Often, he had to torture the condemned beforehand, break their bones, tear their flesh, extract confessions under duress. He might oversee a hanging and then disembowel the corpse. He might light the fire under the stake. He might place a severed head on a pike. He might have to stand there afterward, cleaning up the blood and bits of brain, while a priest mumbled prayers and the crowd dispersed. And no matter how well he did his job, no one wanted to shake his hand. Executioners were socially radioactive. Even if they were technically respected, they were also avoided. They lived on the outskirts of town. Their children were shunned. They had their own entrance to churches, if they were allowed in at all. Some were forbidden from eating in public. Others were required to wear special clothing, not unlike criminals or lepers. There was a paradox here. The executioner was essential to maintaining law and order, but at the same time, he was treated as morally polluted, a necessary evil, not a person. He had power, terrifying power, but no real social standing. And then there's the psychological toll. Imagine doing this every week, sometimes every day, killing strangers, killing neighbors, killing children. There were no therapists in the 14th century, no debriefing sessions, just you, your memories, and the screams. There are records of executioners going mad, of becoming alcoholics, of turning violent, of becoming emotionally numb. Some became sadists, addicted to the act. Others collapsed under the weight of it, begging to be replaced. Some even took their own lives. And it didn't end with executions. These men were also responsible for torture, mutilations, amputations, and branding. If a thief was to lose a hand, it was the executioner who wielded the knife. If a woman was to be burned, he tied the ropes. If a man was to be broken on the wheel, the executioner placed the limbs, then struck the hammer. And let's not forget the practical complications. Bodies needed to be dealt with. Heads needed to be boiled for preservation. Some rulers demanded that the head of a traitor be dipped in pitch and displayed for weeks. Guess who had to do that? That's right, our friend the executioner, working overtime. In some towns, executioners moonlighted in related trades. They became knackers, people who disposed of dead animals, or bone collectors. Some worked as surgeons or barbers, since they had anatomical experience and sharp tools. Yes, you could be beheaded in the morning, and have your beard trimmed by the same man in the afternoon. Medieval life was efficient. Oddly enough, executioners sometimes became minor celebrities. A famous one in 16th century France, Charles Henry Sanson, executed over 2,000 people, including Louis XVI. He was both feared and respected, a man who appeared in paintings and memoirs. But this was rare. Most executioners lived anonymous, bitter lives. There were even laws protecting them. If you attacked an executioner, it was a serious offense. Why? Because no one else wanted to take his place. If he quit, your whole judicial system stalled. It's hard to threaten criminals with death when no one's willing to carry it out. But there were rewards. Executioners were often paid well, especially for high-profile deaths. Some were given land, tax exemptions, even special privileges like taking whatever clothing or possessions the condemned had. It was one of the only jobs where looting the corpse was part of the benefit package. Still, the job left a stain. Some men tried to hide their profession when traveling. Others were barred from marriage into respectable families. Some lied to their children. Some became outlaws themselves, embracing the social rejection and turning to robbery. So let's recap. You kill for a living. You're forced to mutilate, burn, and torture. You're hated by everyone you serve. You live in isolation. Your children are bullied. You're haunted by nightmares. But the pay is decent, and the hours are predictable. What a deal. The executioner's life was a brutal contradiction, powerful, but powerless, feared, but lonely, essential, but reviled. So the next time you hear someone say they'd kill for a job, remember, some men actually did, and they never stopped paying for it. If you had a soft spot for animals, medieval Europe was not your paradise, and if you were a rat catcher, you probably lost that soft spot pretty quickly. Let's enter the vermin-infested alleys, basements, and plague pits of the Middle Ages to meet one of the most reviled and essential professions in the medieval urban food chain, the rat catcher. The man, often poor and desperate, who was sent into the dark corners of the world to confront a furry, diseased enemy that outnumbered people and never slept. Medieval cities were teeming with rats. Black rats, primarily, though other types appeared later. They came for the grain, stayed for the filth, and multiplied like, well, like rats. Every home, every warehouse, every barn, every ship had them. You might see one skitter across your floor, or you might hear them rustling in the walls. You might even wake up with one on your face. And then there was the plague. Yes, that plague, the Black Death. By the mid-14th century, everyone understood that where there were rats, there was death. No one had discovered bacteria or the role of fleas yet, but people could see a pattern. Rats brought doom, so rat catchers became weirdly important and deeply feared. Let's start with the job itself. A rat catcher's main task was simple in theory: kill rats. But rats were smart, fast, and determined to survive. They could climb walls, chew through wood and stone, and hide in spaces no human could reach. So how did you catch them? With dogs, ferrets, sticks, smoke, and poison. Rat catchers trained small terriers to root out nests. They sent ferrets into burrows. They used pitch-coated sticks to trap them, or smoke to drive them out of hiding. Some mixed arsenic or ground glass into food scraps as bait. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't safe. It was constant warfare, in basements, in granaries, in the crawl spaces of churches and castles. These men got scratched. They got bitten. They got rabies, infections, parasites, and, inevitably, the plague. Some were proud of their immunity, joking that the rats wouldn't dare infect them. Others were walking plague vectors themselves, unknowingly spreading disease from one job site to another. And it wasn't just the danger, it was the filth. A rat catcher was usually covered in bites, boils, and blood. Sometimes the rat's, sometimes his own. His clothes were ragged. His boots were chewed. His tools were gnawed. His hands were calloused and blistered. He stank, like fear, sweat, rat urine, and the strange combination of smoke and meat that came from burning nests. And then there were the live rats. Yes, because in a strange twist of logic, rat catchers didn't just kill rats, they sometimes collected them. They'd keep cages of half-dead rats to prove their skill, or to train their dogs. Others sold them for public entertainment, because nothing delighted a medieval crowd like watching dogs tear rats apart in an inn yard. Some even claimed their rats were magical, or used them in scams. One popular trick was to release rats into a rich person's house, then show up the next day offering to fix the sudden infestation, for a price. This made rat catchers both useful and untrustworthy. People needed them, but didn't want them near their families. Rumors swirled. Some thought rat catchers bred rats on purpose, just to ensure they'd never be out of work. Others accused them of black magic, suggesting they could control swarms with whistles or incantations. In truth, most rat catchers were clever and resourceful, but not supernatural. One famous rat catcher from 16th century London claimed to have caught over 25,000 rats in his career, and kept meticulous notes. Another wandered from town to town with a sack full of dead vermin, showing off his kills like trophies. They weren't lying low, they were living symbols of pestilence who also, paradoxically, offered salvation. But they paid a price. Socially, rat catchers were on the bottom rung. No one wanted to marry them. No one invited them to feast days or town fairs. Some were forbidden from sleeping within the city walls. They were dirty, smelly, and vaguely dangerous, the kind of people who made children cry, and priests quietly usher them toward the back. And yet, they were often the first ones, called when a warehouse went quiet, or when squeaking behind the wall got a little too loud. Landlords hired them to keep tenants from fleeing. Bakers hired them to protect flour. Town councils paid bounties per rat tail delivered. Yes, rat tails, like a gruesome punch card for pest control. But money didn't bring comfort. Rat catchers lived in cheap housing. They were sick more often than not. Their fingers were missing tips. Their lungs burned from the smoke they used to flush out nests. Their dogs, while loyal, died young, often mauled by their tiny enemies. If the rats didn't kill you, the long-term exposure to poison fumes probably would. There's one more detail we shouldn't ignore. They were blamed for the plague. When entire streets started dying, people pointed fingers. Sometimes it was the Jews, sometimes it was the beggars, but often it was the rat catchers, because wherever death happened, rats followed, and the rat catcher wasn't far behind. Some were beaten, others driven out of town. A few were hanged on suspicion of spreading illness. The logic was as flawed as it was medieval, but in times of fear, anyone who handled vermin for a living was seen as a kind of walking omen. Despite all this, some rat catchers built small empires. The clever ones hired apprentices, set up operations in multiple towns, learned how to trap efficiently and charge premium rates. They never got rich, exactly, but they climbed out of poverty, so long as they could survive long enough. By the late Middle Ages, the profession began evolving. Traps improved. Understanding of disease shifted slightly. Cities experimented with organized pest control. But for most of medieval history, the rat catcher remained a lone, scrappy figure, part hunter, part pariah, always sneezing, always itching, always slightly cursed. So, the next time you see a rat and instinctively shudder, remember the man who spent his entire life crawling through infested corners, listening for rustling, always one scratch away from a very itchy, very painful death. And if he offered you a cage full of rats, for a fair price, maybe just nod politely and slowly back away. If you've ever enjoyed the feel of a soft leather boot, a sturdy belt, or a supple book cover, you owe a quiet, gagging thanks to one of the most reviled professions in medieval Europe, the tanner. Tanning, turning raw animal skins into usable leather, was a job so vile, so rancid, so universally despised that entire sections of cities were pushed to the outermost limits just to keep the smell away from decent society. If you were a tanner in the Middle Ages, your life was not only soaked in blood, feces, and urine, it was literally downwind from everyone else's. Let's begin with what tanners actually did. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't mystical. It was chemical warfare on dead things. Tanners took raw animal hides, usually from cows, sheep, goats, or pigs, and turned them into durable leather through a brutal cocktail of scraping, soaking, rotting, and chemical bathing. Sounds simple. Let's walk through it step by step. And hold your nose. First came fleshing. After slaughter, a hide still had bits of fat, tissue, and sometimes dried blood clinging to it. The tanner's first job was to scrape all of this off by hand using curved knives or metal scrapers. This was messy, exhausting, and dangerous. Slippery hides meant accidental slices were common, and infections a daily threat. Next was the soaking stage, and here's where things get fragrant. Hides were dunked into vats of water, mixed with urine, lime, or animal dung, depending on the local recipe. Yes, human urine, fresh if you were lucky, but usually collected in buckets from households, sometimes fermented for days. Why? Because urine contains ammonia, which helps break down hair and loosen fats. Dung was added as a softening agent, since it contains enzymes that aid in the breakdown of the skin. The result? A bubbling, frothing vat of brown stew, in which tanners stood ankle deep, stirring hides with poles or even their bare hands. The smell was described in medieval records as enough to turn the milk sour, or kill a dog at 30 paces. Tanners often lost their sense of smell entirely, or simply became accustomed to it, much like you'd get used to a low-grade curse. Then came deherring. Once the urine-lime mixture had worked its magic, the hides were scraped again, this time to remove the loosened fur. Imagine a giant sheet of thick, wet, smelly skin, and you're leaning over it, pulling off soggy hair with a knife, knowing you have 50 more to go before lunch. Still not done. The hide, now bald and bloated, was rinsed and stretched, then treated with tannins, plant-based chemicals derived from tree bark, especially oak. This part of the process could take weeks or even months, depending on the quality desired. Hides were soaked in acidic tannin solutions, gradually transforming into something that wouldn't rot immediately when exposed to air. By the end of the process, you had something resembling leather, strong, flexible, and incredibly valuable. But the men who made it were considered disgusting. Why? Because everything about tanning was filthy. The clothes, the hands, the breath. Tanners couldn't hide what they did. They reeked. You could smell them coming before you saw them. No perfume, no holy water, no festival mask could disguise the scent of someone who spent their days elbow deep in fermented waste. They weren't allowed to work near markets, churches, or town centers. Tanneries were usually located downstream, where the polluted runoff wouldn't infect the drinking water, at least, not right away. These districts were gray, sticky, and loud. Dogs barked, rats feasted, flies swarmed. The smell hung in the air like a curtain. In hot weather, it intensified to nearly mythic proportions. Tanners were also social outcasts. Though their product was essential, everyone needed leather for shoes, saddles, armor, belts, bags, even book bindings. The tanners themselves were treated like human trash. They were barred from public offices in some cities. Some were forbidden from marrying outside their trade. Others were refused burial in sacred ground, unless their bodies were specially cleansed. There's a reason why in many medieval towns, Tanner's Lane was literally the last street before the city walls. If a tanner wanted to sell his leather, he had to cart it upwind, past guards and citizens who held their noses and glared. And yet it was steady work. Every city needed leather. Every castle needed armor. Every monastery needed book bindings. And tanners, for all their stench, had job security. Their craft was difficult to learn, required physical strength and chemical knowledge, and could not be rushed. The best tanners commanded higher prices. Some even formed guilds, though they were considered lower status than the more refined crafts like weaving or shoemaking. But even guild membership couldn't clean up their image. In literature and art, tanners were often brutish, dirty, and crude. They were depicted as brawlers, drunkards, or foul-mouthed tradesmen. It was as if the moral stink of their work clung to their souls. Did they ever push back? Occasionally. Some tanners grew wealthy and bought property. Others funded chapels or left generous donations in their wills in an attempt to be accepted. But even then, they remained slightly tainted. The profession itself was never glamorous, no matter how much money leather could bring. And the health effects, predictably grim. Long exposure to lime and urine caused skin burns, respiratory illness, and loss of vision. Many tanners developed chronic infections, arthritis, or rotting teeth from the fumes and chemical contact. Cuts could fester for weeks. Some lost fingers. Others went blind in one eye. All of them aged early and died young, usually without fanfare, often without family. In many ways, tanners were the medieval world's hidden foundation. Their leather protected knights in battle, preserved sacred texts, shod the poor and rich alike, and yet they were never thanked, never honored, and often literally avoided in the streets. So, next time you see a luxurious leather-bound book, or a museum full of medieval boots and belts, take a moment to appreciate the man who stood in a pit of urine, coughing and swearing, scraping hair from a bloated hide while flies danced around his head. He may have smelled like death, but without him, medieval life would have fallen apart at the seams. If you think your job sucks, spare a moment for the medieval leech collector, a man whose job literally involved being sucked by hundreds of slimy, hungry, little parasites. Before we dive into the bog, that is, let's set the scene. In the medieval world, bloodletting was considered one of the finest methods of medicine. Got a fever? Let some blood out. Headache? Blood. Swollen leg? Blood. Dizziness? Melancholy? Gout? Demons? Obviously, blood. The prevailing theory was that the body had four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that illness was caused by an imbalance. The easiest humor to remove was blood. Convenient, right? And while doctors and barbers were more than happy to open a vein with a knife, there was an even more fashionable method: leeches. Yes, those squishy, wriggling waterworms with suckers at both ends, and an appetite for warm blood. So who supplied this booming market? Enter the leech collector, a man, or sometimes woman, who spent their working days wading through marshes, swamps, and bogs, attracting leeches the old-fashioned way, by letting them latch onto their own bare legs. Let's be perfectly clear, this was not a tool-heavy job. There were no nets, no traps, no clever gadgets. You needed a stick for balance, maybe a cloth sack for storage, and most importantly, exposed flesh. You walked into murky, leech-filled water, stood still, and waited. When you felt the little vampires attach themselves, you'd pluck them off, and shove them into your sack, probably still wriggling. Easy money. Not quite. Leeches are not gentle feeders. They pierce the skin with sharp, needle-like jaws and inject anticoagulants and anesthetics, so you often didn't feel the bite, but you did notice the bleeding. The wounds kept oozing for hours afterward. Now imagine dozens of bites at a time, your legs turning red with blood, your skin dotted with circular bruises, and all of this happening every single day. In many regions, especially rural England, France, and parts of Germany, professional leech collectors became a common sight. They were often poor laborers, elderly men, or even children. In fact, kids were preferred in some areas because they had thinner skin and less body hair, easier for the leeches to find a grip. The job was seasonal, of course. In colder months, the leeches became sluggish or hibernated. But in the spring and summer, when the air was thick, and the water was warm, and buzzing with mosquitoes, business was booming. Apothecaries, physicians, monasteries, and even barbers needed constant supplies of live leeches. Dead ones were useless. They had to be fresh, fat, and very much alive. Now imagine the daily routine of a leech collector. You wake up before dawn. You trudge out to the swamp, mud caking your boots. You roll up your trousers, or don't bother with any. You wade in, thigh deep in cold water. You stand still, trying not to shiver. The leeches rise from the muck, drawn to your body heat and scent. They attach, dozens of them. You feel them squirming against your skin. You let them feed a little, then carefully remove them and place them into your leech bag, which smells like rotting pondweed and old blood. Repeat until full, or until you faint, because blood loss was very real. Some collectors suffered from chronic anemia. Others developed infections from repeated bites. It wasn't uncommon to collapse after a long day in the swamp. Many had permanent scars or ulcers on their legs. Still others suffered bizarre allergic reactions, or developed fevers from bacteria passed by the leeches themselves. And let's not forget the swamp itself. These were not clean, peaceful ponds. They were crawling with hazards, sharp reeds, biting insects, snakes, stagnant water, and rotting animal remains. In some areas, stepping into a bog too quickly could suck you in up to your waist, or worse. Leech collectors also had to compete with other wildlife. Birds, frogs, and fish also fed on leeches, so the best collecting spots were often guarded or kept secret. Some families passed down leeching sites like heirlooms, guarding them jealously. Fights broke out. Swamps were sabotaged. Rival collectors would spread false rumors about leech infestations to keep competition away. And what about payment? Leeches weren't exactly luxury goods, but they were in demand. A skilled collector might sell 100 leeches a week, depending on location and size. Some were paid by the dozen, others by weight. In peak seasons, especially during plague outbreaks or battlefield campaigns, the price shot up. But even then, leech collecting never made anyone rich. It was subsistence work, wet, cold, painful, and endless. And yet, despite all this, the leech collector was a respected supplier. Doctors and barbers relied on them. Apothecaries treated them politely. Town officials allowed them special permits. They were like the UPS drivers of medical vampirism, dirty, reliable, and always slightly damp. But socially, they weren't exactly admired. They smelled like marsh rot. They bled constantly. Their bags wriggled. Children were terrified of them. Superstitions grew around them. Some believed leech collectors could curse you, or spread disease through touch. Others claimed they were protected by water spirits or witches. As with most unpleasant medieval jobs, their relationship to the supernatural was suspiciously ambiguous. In some towns, leech collectors became informal folk healers, offering leeches along with herbal remedies, advice, or basic first aid. It was the closest some rural people ever got to medical attention. Whether the treatment worked is a matter of, let's call it, medieval optimism. By the late Middle Ages, leech collecting began to shift. More organized supply chains formed. Some monasteries started breeding leeches in ponds. Others imported them from abroad. But still, the freelance collector endured well into the 19th century, especially in more isolated areas. So, to review, you walk into a swamp. You let creatures attach to your bare skin and drink until they swell. You bleed. You swell. You itch. You contract swamp fevers. You sell your blood-filled cargo to a man with a curly mustache and a questionable medical license. You go home, light a candle, and try not to faint on your own floor. The job of the leech collector was utterly medieval, equal parts nature, superstition, medicine, and misery. And yet, thanks to them, countless nobles, monks, and kings had their blood safely drained in style, because nothing says advanced medicine quite like a bag of swamp worms and a man with soggy boots. In the hierarchy of unpleasant medieval jobs, there is a profession so foul, so literally full of crap, that even the rat catchers turned up their noses. Enter the gong farmer, the man whose job was to shovel, carry, and dispose of human excrement, one bucket at a time. If you've ever romanticized medieval castles, or imagined a quaint little town square with chirping birds and market stalls, it's time for a reality check. Behind every timber-framed house, and under every noble but sad cesspit, a deep, dark hole where waste accumulated for weeks, months, sometimes years. No plumbing, no flushing, just gravity, time, and an eventual stink so potent it could be smelled halfway down the street. That's where the gong farmer came in. The word gong in this case comes from the Old English gang, meaning to go, as in, where people went, and what they left behind had to be removed by hand. Let's paint the scene. It's midnight. The town is quiet. You, the gong farmer, prepare for your shift. You work at night because your job is so disgusting. The city laws forbid you from operating during daylight. It disturbs the populace. It upsets the livestock. It's just better for everyone if they don't see you doing it. Armed with a shovel, a bucket, and a lantern, you descend into the bowels of the city. Literally, cesspits could be found behind homes, beneath privies, toilets, or in the basements of inns, castles, and bathhouses. They varied in depth, from a few feet to massive underground vaults that hadn't been emptied in years. And here's the worst part, you had to climb inside. The job of a gong farmer was to dig out the thick, festering, semi-solid sludge of human waste that had been fermenting in the dark. This included feces, urine, vomit, and whatever else people had thrown down the latrine hole. Rotten food, dead rats, the occasional chicken. Everything had softened, blended, and turned a uniform shade of hellish brown. The stench, described in historical texts as eye-watering, gut-wrenching, and spiritually demoralizing. Some said it could knock a man unconscious. Others simply vomited and kept digging. There were no gloves, no masks, no ventilation. You stood in it. You scooped it. You filled your bucket and passed it to your assistant, who carried it up to the surface and dumped it into a cart covered with tarpaulin. Once full, the cart was wheeled outside the town walls to a designated dumping area, often called a dung hill, gong heap, or delightfully, a night soil field. The contents might be burned, buried, or used as fertilizer on nearby farms. Yes, medieval agriculture sometimes ran on human waste. Think about that the next time you hear the term organic. As you might expect, the work was hazardous. Cesspits released toxic gases, methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide. In poorly ventilated chambers, workers could suffocate without warning. Some fell in and drowned. Others developed chronic skin infections, sores, or lost fingernails from the acidity of the waste. Yet for all this, gong farmers made decent money, at least by medieval standards. Their work was essential. Without them, cities would become uninhabitable swamps of disease and filth. During the hot summer months, the buildup of waste became unbearable. Pestilence, cholera, dysentery, these weren't abstract threats. They were direct results of poor sanitation, so towns paid well to keep their cesspits empty. In London, gong farmers were sometimes employed by the city or by wealthy households. They were paid by the load, often called tons, and kept on retainer for large estates. A single large manor could require weekly cleanings, depending on how much feasting was going on. Castles with dozens of residents, even more frequent. Some gong farmers became surprisingly wealthy, though they remained socially outcast. Because let's be honest, no one wanted to socialize with the Pooh Man, even if he had coin in his purse. A gong farmer was avoided in markets, shunned in churches, and generally not invited to parties. The stench clung to their skin. Their homes were often isolated, near the dumping grounds. Children made fun of them. Women avoided them. They were considered unclean, even though, ironically, they were keeping everyone else cleaner. In some places, gong farmers were required to wear specific clothing, often leather or heavy wool, designed to keep the mess from soaking through. Others wrapped their faces in cloth or carried herbs to help mask the smell, but nothing could really hide it. If you were a gong farmer, you were visibly and olfactorily different from everyone else. The job was so extreme that it became metaphorical in medieval language. To say someone was fit for the gong was an insult, implying they were no better than the contents of the cesspit. And yet, the irony persisted. Society needed them desperately, but also pretended they didn't exist. So why do it? Well, money, for one, for the poor, illiterate, and desperate. Being a gong farmer offered a strange kind of security. The work was steady. The pay was reliable. You were doing something important, even if no one admitted it. Some men even passed the job down to their sons, forming generations of waste handlers, all of whom likely died early and smelled terrible, but left their families a little less destitute. And then there were the unexpected perks. Gong farmers occasionally found treasures in the muck. Coins, jewelry, even daggers dropped down privys by accident, or in some cases, during hasty getaways. One lucky digger reportedly found a gold ring, engraved with the noble family crest. Another discovered a stash of stolen silver hidden beneath the waist. There were whispers of gong farmers retiring early after such finds, though whether they managed to wash off the stink of their trade is another question. By the end of the Middle Ages, sanitation began to improve, slightly. Some towns experimented with covered sewage ditches. Others banned open cesspits altogether. But for most of medieval history, the gong farmer was a necessary evil, crawling into holes others dared not look at, digging through humanity's most literal waste. So next time you flush a toilet, take a moment to be grateful, not just for plumbing, but for the long line of men, in woolen trousers and leather aprons, who kept the cities from collapsing into their own filth. They may not have had honor, or status, or even the luxury of fresh air, but they kept civilization's bowels moving, one bucket at a time. If you think medieval jobs couldn't get any crueler, meet the quarrymen, the rugged, tough men who literally chipped away at the stone foundations of Europe's castles, cathedrals, and cities. Their lives were a brutal mix of dust, danger, and back-breaking labor, with a death toll to match. Quarries were the source of the raw stone that built medieval Europe's greatest architectural achievements. But getting that stone out of the earth, that was a nightmare. Quarrymen worked in open pits or underground caves, where they had to extract huge blocks of stone by hand, using primitive tools, hammers, chisels, wedges, and wooden levers. No machinery, no explosives, just muscle and methodical precision. The work was exhausting. Imagine swinging a heavy hammer all day, striking cold, unforgiving rock until your hands bled, then prying massive stone blocks loose, balancing them on crude sleds or carts, hauling them uphill or through narrow tunnels. The environment was harsh, too. Quarries were hot in summer, freezing in winter, often exposed to rain, wind, and mud. In underground quarries, workers faced pitch-black darkness, dampness, and choking dust. That dust, fine, mineral-rich particles, was the quarryman's silent killer. Breathing it in all day caused silicosis, a deadly lung disease, that filled their lungs with scar tissue, and left them gasping for breath. No masks, no ventilation, just dusty death. In addition to disease, quarrymen faced constant physical hazards. Falling rocks, collapsing walls, and slips on uneven terrain were common. One wrong move, and a block weighing hundreds of kilograms could crush a man instantly. Tools shattered, fingers got smashed, backs broke. In some quarries, men worked underground, in tunnels barely wide enough to crawl through. These were called adits or mines, and the dangers multiplied. The risk of cave-ins was high, as was the danger of flooding. Sometimes they had to pump water out manually, or bale it with buckets. Despite the risks, quarrying was essential. Without these men, no castle walls, cathedral arches, or city streets. Their stone was the backbone of medieval civilization, but the quarrymen themselves were treated like expendable labor. Pay was low, working hours were long, and seasons short, because weather determined when quarrying was possible. Snow, ice, or heavy rain shut down operations, leaving men unemployed and hungry. Because the work was so tough, quarrymen often formed tight-knit communities around the pits. They shared dangers, stories, and hardships. Sometimes their families lived nearby in small, bleak settlements known as quarry villages, clusters of hovels, where the air was thick with dust and the noise of stone striking stone. Medieval literature rarely praised quarrymen. They were seen as rough, uneducated, and unruly. Some were hired as mercenaries or soldiers when work was slow, because they were tough, used to pain, and had a reputation for ferocity. Yet, quarrymen were crucial. Many medieval guilds included stoneworkers who started as quarrymen, learning the craft before becoming masons or sculptors. But as quarrymen, they were at the bottom of the stone trade, doing the grunt work with no glory, no rest, and constant risk. So next time you admire a medieval castle or church, remember the quarryman who blasted, chipped, and dragged that stone, who worked his hands to bloody stumps, and breathed in lung-clogging dust every day. His sacrifice literally built the world we study. When we think of medieval cruelty, one job stands out: the executioner, the man responsible for carrying out death sentences, tortures, and punishments that could make your skin crawl. But behind the terrifying mask and the heavy axe lay a complicated life full of paradoxes, isolation, and brutal realities. Executioners were society's designated killers. They were tasked with delivering justice in the harshest form: beheadings, hangings, breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, and all sorts of tortures that medieval courts could devise. The executioner's role was vital to law and order, but it came at an enormous personal cost. The executioner's work was extremely cruel, both physically and psychologically. They wielded weapons designed to maim or kill quickly, but often dealt with botched executions that extended suffering. Imagine the tension and horror of delivering a blow meant to sever a head cleanly, only for the axe to miss or the rope to snap. Beyond the act of killing, executioners sometimes acted as torturers or enforcers, extracting confessions through pain, or overseeing prison conditions. In some cases, they were responsible for branding criminals, whipping prisoners, or even collecting bodies for dissection or burial. Their instruments of death, axes, swords, ropes, wheels, were tools of dread. Some executioners developed specialized skills, like mastering the swift beheading or applying just enough pain during torture to break wills. Others were known for cruelty beyond their orders, adding to the fear and stigma around the profession. But what made the executioner's life truly cruel was the social ostracism they faced. Despite performing a service the law demanded, executioners were pariahs in medieval society. They were shunned, feared, and avoided by nearly everyone. Why? Because of the spiritual pollution associated with death. Medieval beliefs held that killing, even legally sanctioned, touched on sin and impurity. Executioners were seen as tainted by the very act of killing. They couldn't attend church regularly, marry freely, or live among normal people without suspicion. In many towns, executioners lived in isolated quarters, often just outside city walls or near the gallows. Their families bore the stigma, too. Children teased or barred from certain professions or social interactions. Executioners sometimes married among themselves, forming a closed caste. Some executioners were outsiders by birth, foreigners, criminals given a chance for survival if they took the job, or men with few other prospects. Others inherited the role from their fathers, keeping the grim tradition alive. Despite the harshness, the job had advantages. Executioners were often paid well, sometimes better than other laborers. They might receive gifts from nobles or wealthy townsfolk eager to ensure their sentences were carried out swiftly. In some cases, executioners were exempt from certain taxes or allowed privileges denied to others. Still, few envied their life, carrying the burden of death. Seeing so much suffering and living with constant social rejection made for a lonely existence. Many executioners developed reputations as cruel or savage men, true or exaggerated, but few escaped the psychological scars of their trade. Executioners also sometimes acted as a grim reminder to others, a living symbol of the law's reach and the consequences of disobedience. Their masks, black robes, and grim tools were part of medieval theater, designed to instill fear and compliance. In literature and folklore, executioners were often portrayed as villains or monsters, further alienating them from society. Yet, they were necessary agents of medieval justice, no matter how distasteful or feared. So the executioner's life was a paradox, respected and feared, necessary and shunned, powerful yet powerless. A man who took lives, but lost his own social standing, condemned to live among the shadows of death. The cruelest part, the executioner was often forgotten by history, not as a hero, nor as a villain, but as a necessary evil. When you picture medieval knights, you probably think of shining armor, noble battles, and heroic quests. But before any knight could gallop into glory, he had to start somewhere, usually as a squire, a position that was anything but glamorous. In fact, being a knight's squire was one of the most demanding and often brutal jobs a young man could have in medieval times. Squires were typically boys aged 12 to 20, often from noble or wealthy families, training to become knights themselves. But don't imagine a leisurely apprenticeship with sword practice and chivalry lessons all day. The reality was exhausting physical labor, constant humiliation, and a grueling test of endurance. The main role of a squire was to serve his knight in every possible way, which meant carrying heavy armor, maintaining weapons, grooming horses, and attending to all the knight's needs. This included dressing the knight in full armor, which could weigh up to 60 pounds, helping him mount his horse, and cleaning his weapons after battles. Every day was a punishing routine. The squire had to wake early, clean the stables, polish armor, and run errands, often under the watchful, and sometimes cruel, eye of his knight, or the knight's household staff. Mistakes were not tolerated. Being late or careless could result in harsh punishments, sometimes physical. In addition to household duties, squires trained rigorously in the arts of combat. They practiced sword fighting, horsemanship, and archery, but often after exhausting days of labor. Training was a relentless grind designed to harden their bodies and minds for the brutal realities of war. But the job wasn't just physical. Squires also learned about court etiquette, diplomacy, and sometimes literacy. Yet many squires never advanced beyond the menial tasks, trapped by favoritism or politics. One of the cruelest aspects of being a squire was the danger inherent in their apprenticeship. Squires often accompanied knights into battle, where they had to carry equipment, fetch water, or even fight alongside their masters. Many never lived to become knights themselves. The mortality rate for squires on the battlefield was high. On top of that, squires had no real authority or respect. Nobles and common soldiers alike often treated them as servants or punching bags. They faced ridicule and hazing, and the social pressure was immense. The physical toll was severe. Carrying heavy armor and weapons for long hours caused chronic aches, bruises, and injuries. Some squires suffered broken bones in training accidents or battles. Their diets were often insufficient for their exertions, leading to malnutrition or exhaustion. Despite all this, many boys dreamed of knighthood. For some, being a squire was a pathway out of poverty or obscurity. For others, it was the chance to gain honor, land, and wealth. But the journey was long, and few succeeded. So the life of a knight squire was a blend of harsh labor, constant danger, and intense training, a crucible that tested the limits of body and spirit. It was the gateway to glory, but only if you survived the brutal demands along the way. In the world of medieval jobs, the tanner held a curious place. On the one hand, their work was essential, supplying leather for everything from shoes and armor to saddles and book bindings. On the other, it was among the most repugnant and dangerous trades a man could take up, involving foul smells, toxic chemicals, and endless manual labor. Tanning is the process of turning raw animal skins into leather, and it was an ancient craft that hadn't changed much in centuries. The medieval tanner worked with the skins of cows, sheep, goats, and sometimes more exotic animals. But what made the job cruel wasn't just the hard work, it was the stench and the health risks that came with it. Imagine working for hours, every day, standing knee-deep in vats filled with a pungent brew of animal urine, lime, and tannin extracted from tree bark. The stench was so strong that towns often relegated tanneries to the outskirts, or near rivers to keep the smell away from markets and homes. Tanners spent their days scraping flesh and fat off the skins with sharp knives, soaking them in chemical baths, stretching and softening the leather, then drying and finishing it. Each step was physically demanding and required precision to avoid ruining the valuable hides. But the chemicals and the organic material created a toxic environment. Prolonged exposure to lime could cause skin burns and rashes. The stench attracted flies and rats, increasing the risk of disease. Workers often suffered from respiratory problems due to the fumes. Tanners' hands and arms were often covered with sores and cuts. The constant moisture and chemicals meant infections were common and difficult to heal. Plus, the work was seasonal and could involve long, exhausting days, especially in summer when the sun baked the hides. Socially, tanners were often considered unclean or low status because of their association with animal carcasses and foul smells. Their profession was essential, yes, but they were sometimes shunned by other townsfolk. Churches occasionally forbade tanners from holding certain positions or attending ceremonies regularly. Despite this, the trade could be profitable. Skilled tanners who mastered the craft could earn a decent living and supply leather goods that were in constant demand, especially during times of war, when leather armor and horse tack were crucial. In some towns, tanners formed guilds that regulated the quality of leather, set prices, and protected their members. This gave them some community and influence, though it never fully erased the stigma. In short, the life of a tanner was a constant battle against smell, sickness, and social exclusion. Their hands crafted the essential materials of medieval life, but their days were soaked in sweat, chemicals, and the ever-present scent of death and decay. Salt may seem like a simple seasoning today, but in medieval times, it was a precious commodity, so vital that entire economies depended on it. But the men who extracted salt from underground mines or salt pans faced some of the most brutal and dangerous working conditions of the era. The salt miner's job was cruel in ways that are easy to underestimate until you picture the long hours spent digging in dark, cramped, and hazardous environments where death was a constant risk. Salt was used not just for flavor, but for preserving food, especially meat and fish, without refrigeration. This made it critical for survival, armies, and trade. Demand was huge, and those who controlled salt often controlled wealth and power. But the miners who extracted it were expendable, working in extreme conditions for low pay. Salt mining came into main forms: rock salt mining and salt evaporation pans. Rock salt miners worked underground, digging tunnels deep into salt deposits that had formed millions of years ago. Salt pan workers gathered salt crystals from large shallow ponds after seawater had evaporated under the sun. For the miners underground, the environment was suffocating and unstable. Tunnels were narrow and low, sometimes requiring miners to crawl or stoop for hours. The air was thick with dust and salt particles, which irritated lungs and could cause chronic respiratory problems, a disease known today as salt miner's lung. The risk of cave-ins was constant. Mines often collapsed suddenly, burying men alive. Rescue was nearly impossible, and bodies were sometimes left where they fell for weeks or months. Miners used basic wooden supports that rotted or broke easily. Then there was the problem of flooding. Many salt mines intersected with underground water, which could quickly fill tunnels, drowning workers. Pumps were primitive, and efforts to keep tunnels dry were slow and dangerous. The physical labor was grueling. Miners used pickaxes and shovels to chip away at the rock, often working in near darkness lit only by flickering torches or candles. Their bodies were sore, their hands blistered, and their muscles strained from the constant digging and hauling. The salt itself was corrosive. Skin and eyes often burned from contact with salt crystals and brine. Clothes and tools rusted quickly, adding to the challenge. The constant exposure also led to dehydration and skin damage, because salt draws moisture from the body. Salt pan workers faced a different set of problems. They worked outside in open fields, exposed to harsh sun in summer and freezing temperatures in winter. Long hours spent standing in brine-filled ponds meant cold, numb limbs and painful skin conditions. The smell of rotting seaweed and salt was ever present, Both types of salt workers suffered from poor nutrition and exhaustion. Their
Socially,
diets rarely
salt
matched the
miners
physical
were often
demands
viewed
of their
as
jobs,
low-status laborers,
which meant many,
despite
were weak,
the critical
prone
importance
to illness,
of their work,
and
they
died
lived
young.
in small,
Rough communities near the mines or pans, isolated from town centers. In some regions, salt miners were bound to their employers in a form of servitude, unable to leave due to debts or contracts. Despite these conditions, salt miners were a vital part of medieval society. Their work allowed armies to march, merchants to trade, and families to survive through harsh winters. But their sacrifice was largely invisible, a bitter, salty price paid with blood, sweat, and often life itself. In medieval society, few jobs were as vital and as grueling as that of the miller. The miller was responsible for grinding the grain that fed entire communities. Without their labor, no bread, no porridge, no ale. But behind this essential role lay a world of harsh physical toil, dangerous machinery, and social suspicion. Milling was a physically demanding job. Whether working at a watt mill by a river or a windmill on a hilltop, the miller had to constantly maintain, repair, and operate heavy, grinding stones that crushed grain into flour. These stones weighed hundreds of pounds and had to be aligned precisely to avoid ruining the grain, or worse, injuring the miller. Daily tasks included cleaning grain, feeding it into the hopper, monitoring the grindstones, and sifting the flour. The miller often worked long hours, from before dawn until after dusk, especially during harvest season, when grain supplies peaked. The risk of injury was high. Millstones could cause serious harm if fingers, hands, or clothing got caught in the machinery. Stories abound of millers losing limbs or lives to their own tools. The heavy stones also demanded great physical strength to move for maintenance or repairs. Working conditions were tough. Mills were noisy, dusty places. The constant grinding kicked up flour dust, which could cause respiratory problems over time. The dust, mixed with sparks from wooden machinery, sometimes caused fires or explosions. Millers' work was also filthy. Flour stuck to skin and clothing, mixing with sweat and grime. The smell of damp grain and the river or coastal winds, where many mills stood, was ever present. Seasonal flooding or drought could disrupt operations and threaten livelihoods. But the cruelty of being a miller wasn't only physical. Socially, millers were often distrusted or disliked. They stood between peasants and their precious grain, controlling access to flour. Because the miller charged fees, sometimes unfairly, rumors and accusations of cheating were common. Peasants blamed millers for poor flour or high costs, creating tension. Some millers exploited their position, taking extra grain or mixing an inferior product. But even honest millers faced suspicion and scorn. This social stigma left many millers isolated or living on the fringes of their communities. Despite all this, milling was a critical trade, and some millers earned good incomes, especially those owning their mills or working for wealthy lords. But the hard, risky work and social hostility made it one of the crueler medieval jobs. So when you bite into a crusty loaf of medieval bread, remember the miller who labored in noise, dust, and danger, grinding the grain that kept the kingdom fed. When we imagine medieval warfare, it's often the knights on horseback, gleaming in armor, who get all the glory. But the backbone of any medieval army was the foot soldier, the grunt who marched, fought, and died in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. For many men, being a soldier was a cruel job defined by danger, exhaustion, and little reward. Medieval foot soldiers came from all walks of life: peasants conscripted by lords, mercenaries hired for pay, or young men seeking adventure or escape from poverty. But regardless of origin, the life of a foot soldier was brutal and unforgiving. First, there was the march. Soldiers often traveled dozens of miles on foot, carrying heavy weapons, shields, and sometimes armor that could weigh 40 to 60 pounds. The roads were rough, muddy, and dangerous. Blisters, sprains, and exhaustion were constant companions. Food was scarce and low quality. Armies lived off the land, often looting or begging for supplies, which meant long periods of hunger or eating spoiled food. Disease spread rapidly in camps, where sanitation was poor and overcrowding common. Once battle began, soldiers faced terrifying odds. They fought in tight formations, wielding swords, spears, axes, or pikes against enemy forces armed similarly. The chaos of battle was horrific, Men were cut down by blades or crushed underfoot. There was no armor to protect many foot soldiers, making death or serious injury common. Wounds were often fatal because medieval medicine was primitive. Infection and gangrene claimed more lives than the battlefield itself. Amputations were crude and painful, and survival depended on luck and strength. Beyond the physical dangers, soldiers endured psychological cruelty. War was a test of endurance, fear, and loyalty. Many soldiers witnessed the death of comrades, suffered the trauma of combat, and faced uncertain futures if captured or wounded. Discipline in medieval armies was harsh. Soldiers caught deserting, stealing, or disobeying orders faced brutal punishments, flogging, mutilation, or execution. Despite their risks, many soldiers were poorly paid, or not paid at all, relying on plunder or promises of land and titles that rarely materialize. Life as a soldier was also short. Most men did not survive many campaigns, succumbing to wounds, disease, or exhaustion. The constant threat of death hung over every step. However, for some, soldiering offered a chance for social advancement or wealth, especially mercenaries who fought for pay or nobles, seeking glory. Still, for the majority, it was a harsh existence, defined by suffering and struggle. The foot soldier's life was a cruel combination of relentless hardship, mortal danger, and little recognition, yet without them, medieval armies would have been toothless. When we think of medieval nobles, castles, and grand banquets, it's easy to imagine a life of luxury, power, and ease. But behind every lord and lady was an army of servants who kept the household running, and their work was often some of the most cruel and relentless labor in medieval society. Servants in noble households performed a staggering range of duties: cleaning, cooking, washing clothes, tending fires, caring for children, managing stables, and running errands. They worked long hours, often from dawn until after dark, with few breaks and constant pressure to meet the demands of their masters. Physical labor dominated their day. For example, scullery maids scrubbed pots and dishes in freezing water, sometimes for hours on end. Chamber servants had to clean and prepare bedrooms, ensuring every corner was spotless and the firewood stacked just right. Meanwhile, kitchen hands chopped vegetables, slaughtered animals, and prepared food, all under the stress of a bustling household. The work was exhausting, dirty, and repetitive. Servants faced harsh punishments for mistakes, from beatings to dismissal without pay. Their masters expected absolute obedience, and any failure could mean harsh consequences. In addition to physical hardship, servants lived with constant surveillance and little privacy. Noble households were hierarchical and strict, with clear lines of authority. Servants were often pitted against each other, competing for favor or promotion. Socially, servants occupied a low status. Despite their crucial role, they lived in cramped quarters, often in the castle's basements or attics. Away from the family they served, their health suffered from poor diets and harsh working conditions. Yet, this invisible workforce was essential to medieval noble life. Without servants, castles couldn't function. They were the backbone of medieval aristocracy, silently enduring cruelty and exhaustion to maintain the illusion of luxury. For many servants, the job was a harsh survival tactic, providing food and shelter in a world with few alternatives. Some hoped for better opportunities, while others remained trapped in cycles of servitude, overlooked by history but vital to their lords. So while the nobility enjoyed power and privilege, the servants bore the brunt of the work and the cruelty that kept medieval society running. Executioners, the most feared and hated men in town. When we think about medieval justice, the grim figure of the executioner often comes to mind. The man who carried out death sentences, beheadings, hangings, and other brutal punishments. Despite being an essential part of the legal system, executioners were among the most feared, shunned, and despised men in medieval society. Their job was cruel not only in its physical reality, but also in its psychological toll and social consequences. The essential but feared role, executioners were necessary for enforcing laws and maintaining order in a time when the rule of law depended heavily on harsh, visible punishments. From public hangings in town squares to more private beheadings for nobility, executioners performed their duties with chilling efficiency. They were the hands of justice, or terror, and their presence was a stark reminder of the consequences of breaking the law. However, Despite their importance, executioners were often ostracized by society. Most townspeople viewed them with fear, suspicion, and disgust. This social rejection stemmed from the idea that executioners dealt directly with death and blood, making them unclean or cursed. In many communities, executioners were forced to live on the outskirts, in isolation from others. The job was hereditary in many cases. Sons often followed fathers into the role, continuing the family trade despite the social stigma. This created a small, tight-knit group of executioners who were both necessary and marginalized. Psychological burdens and brutality. Executioners faced psychological horrors that went far beyond the physical brutality of their work. Carrying out executions day after day meant being constantly exposed to violence, death, and human suffering. Imagine the mental toll of facing condemned men and women, sometimes pleading for mercy or confessing their sins, knowing that your role was to end their lives. Executioners had to develop a hard, sometimes cold demeanor to cope with the constant weight of death. Some tried to avoid the emotional impact by treating executions as routine tasks, but the psychological scars remain. Historical records suggest that many executioners struggled with guilt, depression, and isolation. Alcoholism and other coping mechanisms were common. The dark rituals surrounding executioners. Executioners didn't just perform physical acts. Their role was often surrounded by superstition and ritual. For example, in some places, executioners wore special clothing, like a black hood or mask, to hide their identity and create a terrifying image. This anonymity protected them but also made them even more mysterious and feared. The instruments of execution, such as swords, axes, or nooses, were treated with reverence or fear. Some executioners believed these tools had supernatural powers or carried curses. They sometimes performed rituals or blessings on their weapons before a job. Public executions themselves were grim spectacles. Crowds gathered to watch, and the executioner's role was not just to kill but to send a message to the community. Crime would be punished severely. Social isolation and stigma. Executioners were often banned from participating in many aspects of social and religious life. They might be barred from entering churches during services or forbidden from certain markets. Their children sometimes faced discrimination or limited marriage prospects. Despite these hardships, executioners had little choice. The job was difficult to refuse, and alternatives were scarce. Some towns offered executioners benefits like tax exemptions, or land to compensate for their social exile. Executioners in popular culture. Medieval executioners have left a lasting mark on culture and imagination. Their fearsome reputation inspired myths, legends, and even modern horror stories. They symbolized both justice and terror, a chilling reminder that the law could be deadly. Underscore 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 underscore. The life of a medieval executioner was one of terrifying necessity, brutal work, and profound loneliness. They were men who walked the line between order and chaos, carrying out the harshest sentences with a heavy price, their place in society and their own peace of mind. Falconers, handling wild birds of prey and noble expectations. When you think of medieval nobility, one of the most glamorous pastimes might be falconry, the ancient sport of hunting wild game with trained birds of prey, like falcons, hawks, and goshawks. But behind the noble elegance of falconry was a demanding, often cruel job. The falconer. These men were responsible for training, caring for, and managing birds that were as wild and unpredictable as the medieval aristocracy itself. The role of a falconer. Falconers were skilled specialists, entrusted with the care of prized hunting birds that could cost a small fortune. Their work began at dawn and ended late, requiring vigilance, patience, and deep knowledge of raptor behavior. Training a falcon was no easy task. Falcons are fiercely independent hunters, accustomed to freedom and the wild. Falconers had to tame and bond with these birds through constant handling, feeding, and careful conditioning. They taught the falcons to return after striking prey, a delicate process involving rewards, discipline, and sometimes harsh methods. This work demanded physical toughness. Falconers spent hours outdoors in all kinds of weather, rain, cold, or blazing sun, carrying heavy equipment like hoods, jesses, leather straps, bells, and meat to feed the birds. They also had to be ready to chase after falcons that flew off or were injured during hunts, which could mean long, exhausting searches over rough terrain. Handling dangerous birds. Falcons and hawks are predators, equipped with sharp talons and beaks designed to kill. Falconers had to be constantly cautious to avoid injury. Birds could lash out suddenly, causing deep cuts or broken fingers. Working with them required experience and nerves of steel. Moreover, the birds themselves were fragile in other ways. Illness, injury, or stress could be fatal. Falconers had to know how to treat wounds, care for the birds' diets, and keep them in top condition. Any mistake could mean the loss of an expensive and highly valued bird, serving noble expectations. Falconers didn't work in isolation. They served the aristocrats who owned the birds, often under strict and demanding conditions. Nobles expected their falconry to be flawless entertainment and proof of their status and wealth. This meant falconers faced constant pressure to maintain the bird's readiness and performance. A failed hunt or a lost falcon could bring blame, punishment, or loss of favor. Some falconers were treated well and rewarded, but many lived under the thumb of temperamental lords and ladies, with little freedom or security. Falconry was also deeply ritualized. Nobles observed strict rules and traditions surrounding the sport, and falconers had to adhere to them without question. This included dress codes, hunting protocols, and strict timing. Little personal freedom. Despite their skills, falconers often had low social status. They were servants or retainers within noble households, tied to their lords and with limited personal autonomy. The job was demanding, with few breaks, and often involved living in remote hunting lodges or castles, far from family and community. Falconers' lives revolved around the birds and the hunting season. Off-season, their work didn't stop. They cleaned equipment, bred birds, and prepared for the next season. The constant labor, combined with unpredictable weather and the dangers of working with wild animals, made this one of the tougher medieval occupations. Legacy of falconers. Today, falconry remains a respected tradition, but medieval falconers lived a life that balanced skill, danger, and service under tough conditions. Their work supported an elite pastime while demanding physical endurance, patience, and loyalty. The job of a medieval falconer was a strange mix of exquisite skill and relentless hardship, a reminder that even the most glamorous medieval roles hid a harsh reality behind the scenes. Rope makers, the grueling craft with toxic materials. In medieval times, rope was everywhere, used for ships, construction, farming, and even punishment. But few thought about the men who made it, the rope makers, whose job was one of the most physically demanding and hazardous trades of the era. The rope-making process. Making rope was no simple task. Rope makers worked with rough natural fibers like hemp, flax, or sometimes animal hair. These fibers had to be harvested, soaked, combed, twisted, and spun into long, sturdy ropes strong enough to bear heavy loads. Rope making involved hours of repetitive manual labor, twisting hundreds of feet of fibers, by hand or using basic machinery. Rope makers used a tool called a rope walk, a long straight path sometimes hundreds of feet long, where fibers were stretched and twisted into ropes. The longer the rope needed, the longer the rope walk had to be, meaning the work was often done outdoors, or in long, drafty workshops. Harsh working conditions. The work was grueling. Rope makers had to stand or crouch for hours, twisting thick strands while battling dust, dirt, and constant strain on their backs, hands, and shoulders. Hands became raw and blistered from rough fibers. The coarse hemp and flax could cause painful cuts and splinters. The process also exposed workers to toxic dust and chemicals. To prepare fibers, rope makers often treated them with substances like lime or ash to soften and preserve them. Prolonged exposure caused skin irritations and respiratory problems, including chronic coughing and breathing difficulties. Dangerous materials and health risks. In some regions, rope makers worked near tanneries, or used animal hides to make certain types of rope, exposing themselves to bacteria and foul-smelling chemicals. The damp, dark conditions of workshops led to fungal infections and other illnesses. Because of the physical toll, many rope makers suffered from joint pain, arthritis, and long-term disability. The repetitive nature of the job also caused nerve damage in their hands and arms, known today as repetitive strain injuries. Social status and life. Despite the importance of rope in medieval society, rope makers were often low-status laborers. Their work was dirty, smelly, and hazardous, making it undesirable and poorly paid. Rope makers often lived in cramped quarters near rope walks or docks, where they were exposed to cold and damp weather. The work was often seasonal, depending on demand from shipping and construction, leading to periods of unemployment or extreme poverty. Rope makers and punishment. One cruel irony is that rope makers' products were sometimes used for executions and punishments, the very ropes that hung criminals. This association added to the stigma around their profession, linking them symbolically to death and suffering. Rope making was a grueling, dangerous, and socially stigmatized job in medieval times. The men who made ropes endured physical hardship, toxic exposure, and social isolation, all to supply an essential commodity in a world dependent on strong, reliable rope. Chandlers, candle makers, working with hot wax and lead. In the dark and often gloomy medieval world, candles were a lifeline. They lit homes, churches, and streets after sunset, allowing life to continue past daylight hours. But the men who made these candles, the chandlers, faced one of the most dangerous and demanding jobs of the time, working with hot wax, toxic substances, and open flames in difficult conditions. The candle-making process. Chandlers crafted candles by melting down tallow, animal fat, or beeswax, then pouring or dipping wicks into the molten material repeatedly to build up layers, until the candle reached the desired size. This was a repetitive and hot process. Working near open flames and large pots of boiling fat required constant attention and quick reflexes. Even a small slip could cause serious burns or start fires. Beeswax candles were more expensive and cleaner burning, but most common people used tallow candles, which produced smoke, unpleasant odors, and soot. Dangers of hot wax and lead. In addition to hot wax, many chandlers used lead-based molds or additives to give candles a better shape or weight. Working with lead exposed them to toxic fumes and lead poisoning, which could cause severe health issues like headaches, abdominal pain, and eventually brain damage. Burns were common. Melted wax could splash or spill, causing painful injuries. The risk of fire was constant. Workshops filled with flammable materials and open flames were dangerous places, where accidents often happened. Working conditions and social status. Chandlers worked long hours, especially in winter when demand for candles surged. Their workshops were often cramped, smoky, and poorly ventilated, increasing the risk of respiratory problems and heat exhaustion. Despite their essential role, chandlers usually belonged to the lower social classes. Their work was seen as dirty and hazardous, and their earnings were modest. Economic importance and guilds. Despite hardships, chandlers formed powerful guilds in many towns, which regulated candle production, prices, and quality. Guild membership provided some protections and social standing, but the daily work remained tough. The life of a medieval chandler was a balancing act of skill, danger, and endurance, producing the light that lit the medieval world while risking burns, poisoning, and fire every day. Dock workers and longshoremen. Heavy lifting in harsh weather. In medieval port towns and cities, dock workers and longshoremen played a vital role in the economy by loading and unloading ships, moving cargo from ship to shore, and keeping trade flowing. But their job was one of the toughest and most dangerous labor positions of the time, defined by relentless physical strain and exposure to brutal weather. The hard labor of dock work. Dock work involved moving heavy goods like barrels, sacks of grain, timber, and metal tools. Without modern machinery, everything was done by hand or with simple tools like pulleys, ropes, and carts. Workers had to lift, carry, and stack loads weighing hundreds of pounds, often in awkward and dangerous positions. This repetitive heavy lifting caused exhaustion, muscle injuries, and long-term joint problems. The work was also time-sensitive. Ships needed to unload quickly to continue their voyages, or make room for new cargo, meaning dock workers had to work at a relentless pace. often from dawn till dusk. Harsh weather conditions. Dock workers were exposed to the elements without protection. They worked through rain, snow, icy winds, and scorching sun, often standing on slippery, uneven surfaces near deep water. Falling into the harbor was a constant risk, especially for those who worked on wooden docks and small boats. Many dock workers drowned or suffered hypothermia during accidents. Poor safety and health risks. Medieval docks were chaotic and dangerous. Workers risked crushed limbs from shifting cargo, injuries from sharp tools, and falls from heights while loading goods into ship holds. Sanitation was poor, leading to infections from cuts and scrapes. The combination of wet, cold environments and physical exhaustion made dock workers prone to respiratory illnesses and arthritis. Social and economic conditions. Despite their critical role in trade and commerce, dock workers were among the poorest and lowest status laborers. They were paid low wages, often irregularly, and had little job security. Many dock workers were seasonal laborers or migrants, following trade routes, which meant unstable living conditions and vulnerability to exploitation. Solidarity and organization. In some ports, dock workers formed informal groups or early labor associations to demand better conditions or wages, but these efforts were often met with resistance from merchants and authorities. Dock work was a physically punishing and dangerous job in medieval times, requiring strength, endurance, and courage. Dock workers braved the weather, risked injury and death, and played an essential but underappreciated role in medieval society. Coal miners, toiling underground in darkness and dust. Medieval society depended heavily on coal as a fundamental source of fuel for heating homes, cooking food, and powering the earliest workshops and metalworking industries. But the men who extracted this black gold from the depths of the earth endured one of the most brutal and unforgiving jobs of the time. Coal miners worked underground in cramped, dark tunnels that were often poorly supported and poorly ventilated. Facing constant dangers and physical exhaustion every day, their labor was essential to the functioning of medieval towns and cities. Yet it was a largely invisible and unappreciated hardship. Mining coal in the medieval period was an incredibly primitive and hazardous process. Without modern machinery, miners used only basic hand tools like picks, shovels, and wedges to break apart the rock and dig out coal deposits. These tunnels were typically narrow, forcing workers to crawl or stoop for hours in spaces barely larger than their own bodies. The lack of ventilation meant fresh air was scarce, leading to stifling conditions where the air was thick with dust and poisonous gases. Miners worked in near total darkness, relying on small oil lamps or torches that barely illuminated the claustrophobic passageways. The constant threat of tunnel collapses or sudden floods made every day a gamble with death. The health risks of coal mining were severe and often fatal. The inhalation of coal dust caused what was known as pneumoconiosis, or black lung disease, which damaged miners' lungs and made breathing difficult. Many miners developed chronic coughs, respiratory infections, and eventually suffered respiratory failure. Aside from lung disease, the danger of methane gas pockets, called fire damp, was ever present. If ignited by a spark or flame, these gases could cause devastating underground explosions, killing entire groups of miners in an instant. Even without explosions, the cold, damp, and unsanitary conditions underground took a relentless toll on miners' bodies, leading to arthritis, frostbite, and infections that were often untreated due to the lack of medical care. Despite the indispensable nature of their work, coal miners were among the poorest and least protected workers in medieval society. They were often bound by contracts to local lords, merchants, or mining companies that controlled the mines and dictated harsh working conditions and low pay. These men typically lived in overcrowded, unsanitary housing near the mining sites, where access to clean water and adequate food was limited. The harsh realities of mining life extended beyond the workplace. Miners' families faced poverty, malnutrition, and social neglect. The miners themselves rarely lived long lives, with many dying prematurely from accidents, diseases, or sheer exhaustion. Coal was the lifeblood of medieval towns, enabling not only basic survival but also economic growth through the powering of metal forges, the baking of bread, and heating in cold climates. Miners' relentless toil in the dark, dusty tunnels was the hidden engine beneath the medieval world, supporting the comforts and industries above ground that few ever acknowledged. Their story is a sobering reminder of the human cost behind the fuel that kept the medieval world running, a tale of unyielding hardship, sacrifice, and endurance by a class of workers who were vital yet invisible to most of society.